Good afternoon, everybody. Um, Hope you can hear me okay. And welcome to our last session on grid-scale energy storage. We're going to start this session with a keynote speech from Terran Hill, the Director of Asset Development at National Grid in the USA. I can see he's here online. I can't say I know very much about Terran Hill, but I see that he's been with National Grid for 12, 13 years, with a background in public policy analysis and economics, and has done various roles within National Grid in the US. So I think it'll be really interesting to hear what's been going on in the US and try and understand a little bit how that might differ to what we've seen happening here in the UK. So if you're ready, Terran, I'll just hand over to you.
Thanks, Rachel. Hi, everyone. Can people hear me and see me?
I can hear you and see you.
Awesome. Well, thank you for having me today. I was asked to present on some perspectives of energy storage and how we're using energy storage in the US, specifically at National Grid, as well as talk about one of our landmark projects, our energy storage battery that's located in Nantucket. It's the largest energy storage resource in New England currently, and it went to service just last year. So let me see if I can share some slides with you guys. So for those of you who are not familiar with National Grid in the US, we operate the transmission and gas networks, electric and gas networks over in the UK, but we also operate retail distribution as well as transmission and gas distribution networks over in the US, in the Northeast US, primarily operating in New York City, and New England. We have roughly about 7 million customers, and we provide electricity and gas to 20 million people throughout New England and New York. Here in the US, when we think about how we provide service, it goes all the way down to the retail level. So our jobs at the end of the day is to keep electricity and gas networks really affordable for our customers. So we really take a good service in making sure that electricity and gas is affordable at the end of the day. And we see our role as playing a huge facilitator of moving towards the clean energy transition. So with that, we want to make sure that as we transition to more renewables, that we're making sure that we also help shape that energy future where it's fair for all of our customers at the end of the day. So when you think about the energy transition, at least here in New York and New England, our states are really pushing for a huge acceleration of changing the energy mix from fossil fuel to renewables. So in New York, we have a goal of achieving 70% renewable generation by 2030 and 100% emissions-free network by 2040. Similar goals in New England with an 80% reduction across the board when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. The way that we see ourselves getting there is our states have actually put in targets when it comes to different types of renewable generation. So in New York, our states have said that companies like National Grid, we have to procure up to 9 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2035. Similar in New England, although the numbers are a little lower. And then we also have targets for energy storage, which companies like National Grid have to achieve about 3 gigawatts of energy storage in New York by 2030 and 1,000 megawatt hours by 2025 in Massachusetts. And then we also have targets when it comes to how many chargers that we have to have in communities in order to support 1 million zero emission vehicles by 2025 in New York, and a little lower in Massachusetts and Rhode Island, although there's legislation that is being passed just this week in both Massachusetts and Rhode Island to up the number of zero emission vehicles in our states. When you look at those policy mandates and then you start to look at what does that mean for our energy systems, one of the scenarios that we calculated is that we're going to see a tremendous growth in the amount of load forecasts that's needed when you think about electrification of our transportation sectors as well as our heating sectors. We're seeing roughly about a 2 to 3 increase and the amount of peak loads that we have on our networks today. And we also see our system becoming winter peaking, where today is summer peaking. In order to support that, you're going to see a huge amount of generation that's needed. So when we look at storage, we see storage as playing a tremendous role when it comes to achieving those deep decarbonization goals. For National Grid, we're allowed to own storage throughout our value chain. We have programs where we own storage looking at the bulk power system itself, as well as put in storage in order to support our C&I customers, as well as resiliency levels for our distribution networks. And we're also doing things with our customers where our customers are able to, we call it bring your own storage, where we have programs that we actually incentivize and rebate our customers in order to have their own behind the meter storage, and then they can participate in National Grid programs that we have. When we think about storage, storage is one of those things that has a variety of different use cases. It's really all about the location of storage and looking at that storage at that location to see what is the best value for customers at that location. Right now, we're really in a place where storage, the regulatory frameworks are still in its infancy, where regulatory frameworks are being developed by utilities, actually putting forward proposals and testing out those use cases and seeing what the learnings are and the benefits of those use cases. So if I jump into the Nantucket energy storage project, these are some pictures of the Nantucket site. As I say, it was commissioned last year, right before actually the COVID pandemic started. It is the largest energy storage resource that we have currently in New England, although some others are being built in, and fairly soon this will just be in the top 5. This energy storage solution was really all about the island of Nantucket. The island of Nantucket is about 30 miles south of Massachusetts. It is connected by 2 undersea transmission cables that come off the area of Massachusetts that we call Cape Cod. And that island is an island that really is really a summer vacation, a big tourist destination. Many of you guys might have thought about vacation in Nantucket. It's one of the most beautiful places in New England. During the regular year, this time of year, there's only about 10,000 customers that we have in Nantucket. That grows during the summer months to about 55,000 customers. It was during the summer months that we started looking at the load, and it's actually Nantucket has the highest load growth of all of the New England system, actually, growing roughly about 3.5% a year, where most of our system is actually a relatively flat load growth right now. And during the summer months, if we were to lose one of those cables, we will have insufficient electricity supply to the island. And so our planning criteria says that we have to have redundancy, N-1 contingency. So if we lose one element of the network, we should be able to still be able to operate our network reliably. And so if we lost one of the cables, we noted that during the summer, we would not be able to operate the the Nantucket distribution system during the summer months. So we need to look at some ways to really be able to maintain the security of supply on the island, as well as looking at the costs as well. When you think about transmission cables, even at the short distance there, we were looking at roughly about $150 million to install a third cable to the island. $150 million that would primarily be borne because of the way that we do cost allocation based on beneficiary pays to residents on the island of Nantucket. So increase of rate base, $150 million for only roughly mainly 10,000 customers who pay the bill throughout the year. So we wanted to find a better solution to move forward. And so we looked at a number of different options. So I just spoke about the third cable option. That option was not only extremely expensive, but it also presented some challenges in terms of where we would actually, from an electrical standpoint, be able to install the cable. Let me go back to the slide here. When you look at the island of Nantucket, you see the 2 dots there. Those 2 dots represent the transmission substations that we have on the island. The two cables that currently come into the island come into the Candle Street substation. And if we were to install a third cable, there actually is no room in that substation to install a third cable. And based on also contingency requirements, you will want to keep the third cable away from the existing two cables, which means that we will actually be coming in around the island into the Bunker Road substation that we have that's on the more southern tip of the island, roughly almost in the middle of the island. So not only from a cost perspective, but from a constructability perspective, that was a very difficult option. We also looked at just installing a large gas conversion generator on the island. The main issues with that option really was from an environmental standpoint. I just spent the beginning of the presentation talking about how we're really moving towards a clean energy transition, looking at how do we really decarbonize our networks. From an emission standpoint, that will also have been difficult because the island is not connected to natural gas. And so we will have to bring in either propane or diesel, more than likely diesel, to the island. And then we also looked at doing just a very large battery. We actually took a hybrid option. And the reason why we did the hybrid option is because we needed to still charge the battery. A battery alone, with the duration of when we need to maintain the peak, wasn't really a good option just based on the current technology of energy storage. And so we installed a small generator, an emergency generator, roughly about 10 megawatts, as well as a large energy storage facility, a 48 megawatt hour battery, 6 megawatts, 8-hour duration. So some things that we were looking at, we needed to think about costs, not just the fact that our customers will bear the costs, but also the fact that Nantucket is, compared to the rest of New England, a very high cost area to do business. Everything has to be barged over to the island. The cost of land is extremely expensive there, as well as the time periods where you can actually do work on the island. Barges don't typically work during the winter, so most of the work happens during the summer, which is also the tourist season on the island, which limits in terms of schedule when we could do work. Also thinking about the community impacts, looking at reliability from, is this solution something that would actually meet our criteria for being able to serve the load on the island? A load profile that grows from roughly 20 megawatts peak during the winter to about 55 during the summer. And then thinking about just in terms of the land that we had, would we be able to construct in such a small space? In order to move the project forward, we not only needed to look at our own processes, but also work with our system operator in order to do interconnection studies to figure out how the energy storage could actually be able to connect into the wider New England electricity market, as well as play a role with not just the island itself, but regional market needs. I spoke about some of the challenges that we had in terms of just the storage, those being able to find a storage solution that will be able to give us that adequate duration to be able to serve during the peak, but still have enough time to be able to charge it so that we would be ready for the next peak, as well as just the impact of the energy storage on the local distribution network on Nantucket. It's an island, so because it's an island, it doesn't really have a network system. It is a very radio weak distribution network. So we wanted to make sure that the impact of the smart inverters on the network wouldn't actually cause new faults on the network, as well as being sure that because the energy storage was located at the Bunker Road substation, not the Candle Street substation where the transmission cables connect in, that the timing be right such that if we did lose one of the transmission cables, the Bunker Road substation's energy storage solution would see that and be able to pick up that load relatively quickly. Something that we're always concerned about at National Grid is safety. There are elements of how we designed the energy storage, especially with it being a hybrid project located next to the emergency backup generator, that we incorporate elements of safety by design. There are sensors in order to be able to detect if there's any kind of increase in heat or increase in fire risk, such that the system can be able to shut down right away. Also sensors where we are able to really look at the operation of the storage at our local control centers, as well as, because we procured it by Tesla, Tesla always having 24/7 look at the systems as well. One of the biggest challenges that we're still facing and still working through is really the integration of our new work methods, how the local operators are able to operate and maintain the storage with crews that aren't used to energy storage. These crews on Nantucket is a small crew because it really is just a crew that serves the island of Nantucket, have had to learn a lot about storage in a relatively small amount of time. So some of the benefits, there's been a tremendous amount of benefits that we've seen from this solution. We brought in the Department of Energy, Pacific Northwest National Labs to do some analysis on the project and the benefit of the project to both our customers in Nantucket, but also to the wider New England electricity markets. And what we saw is that the storage actually has benefits that outweigh the cost from on the cost ratio of 2 to 1. And that's because of the being able to defer the cable. So we're not going forward with a third cable. Being able to not only mitigate the outages from a cable itself, but what we're also using the storage for is mitigating outages on the distribution network as well. So if we can, it depends on where the outage is on the island, but depending on the outage on the island, in some cases we're able to use the storage in order to maintain the retail electricity on the island. We haven't started yet, but we are going to also look at the storage to help us with power quality issues, volt-var optimization. And then in the future, part of the reason why we undertook the study with DOE is to see how we could use the storage in our electricity markets in New England. And we see a huge benefit from being able to use the storage in the forward capacity markets, as well as the arbitrage and regulation markets, particularly during the winter months where load is much lower on the island. And we sometimes during spring cold snaps will experience scarcity values in our electricity markets in New England. So the Nantucket project, that's not the only project that we have. It is the largest in our portfolio and currently the largest in New England. But we have also done some smaller projects in upstate New York, one of which went online also around the same time as the Nantucket project. We did 2 bigger projects, 40 megawatt hour projects on the island of Long Island. And very earlier on, we did a flow battery demonstration working with the Department of Energy, 3 megawatt hour vanadium redox battery that was put online a few years ago and still used for research and development purposes in cooperation with the College of Holy Cross in central Massachusetts. So the project has some challenges. Some of the challenges is really about when you think about energy storage. As I said earlier, our national grid we see as playing a huge role in decarbonization and also how we manage our transmission and distribution networks in the future. It will help with the intermittency of renewable generation. However, one of the biggest issues that we face is that our current transmission and distribution planning tools really are not adequate for really being able to model energy storage, being able to model things such as how do we protect the system with energy storage, how do we look at the charge and discharge and its effect on power flows. And because of that, there are some difficulties with fully being able to really bring forward the value and the benefits of energy storage. This is further complicated because every vendor has really proprietary characteristics of their energy storage, particularly the inverters that they use, which are not very easy for us to get when we're going forward and trying to plug that into our models, especially our protection models. We've had to work with vendors specifically once we bring them in order to be able to do that, but we would like to be able to really look at this before we bring in vendors such that we can really evaluate whether storage is the best type of solution to be bringing forward. The second issue around multiple value stacking. The benefit of storage is that it can both charge and discharge. So it acts as a load as well as a supply. And when you think about the Nantucket project is really needed during the summer months where the load is the highest, and we need it in order for that reliability and resiliency standpoint. But during the rest of the year, that same storage can be used in order to really help our electricity markets, especially during scarcity requirements in New England. However, our current regulatory frameworks do not yet really have ways to be able to use to really what we're calling value stack or multiple use cases for energy storage. And there's really no way to really monetize those extra values. There are some, we're working right now with New England in order to be able to use Nantucket as a test case. In New York, we've worked with the New York ISO to put forward a proposal that is right now going through the regulatory process for approval. The other big issue is the duration. So I mentioned earlier that this is a 6 megawatt, 8-hour battery. In reality, it is 2 4-hour batteries, which meant that the cost was higher for this solution. It was roughly about $20 million. Still much cheaper than putting in a third cable, and much more better for the environment compared to just putting in a diesel generator. However, in order for energy storage to really kick off, you're going to need to see it become much more cost effective at longer durations. And there is a big question around lithium ion. When you think about the safety aspects of lithium ion, technology does need to improve such that it becomes safer, or different technologies that utilities can become familiar with fairly quickly. And then lastly, integration into our energy management systems. Being able to keep that supply and demand constant, in which we have full awareness of the system, is absolutely needed. But that becomes very difficult when you have many small resources on the network, and it requires you to integrate these resources into not only your transmission network, but also your distribution network. And for your transmission network to actually have awareness of what's happening at the distribution level. Further complicated by the fact that there are hundreds of different vendors out there for energy storage, which each have their own unique battery management systems, which in itself presents a number of cybersecurity issues. Just on the Nantucket project, it took us roughly about 6 months just working through contractual issues with Tesla in order to figure out how they can both have access to our system, as well as ensure that we were mitigating any of the cyber security concerns. So here's a big overview of the Nantucket project. As you can see, the backup generator is right next to the station, as well as the site of the energy storage, in which there's 4 different arrays. So you can see the 4 boxes, or the 4 sets of boxes for the energy storage facility. So that's really the presentation. Rachel, are we doing questions? How are we doing that?
Yeah, so there'll be, I can ask people again to put questions through the chat, and then I'll raise them with you.
Okay.
I've got a couple for you. I mean, first of all, it's really interesting to see what you're doing and seeing that you've got a lot of the same problems that we have here in the UK with regulatory issues and things like that you're addressing. So I suppose a couple of questions. One is, how much information exchange and learning do you do with the UK in that regard, or is it just too different, the regulatory framework there is the first question, I guess.
So we speak in terms of the market issues. We have done a number of learnings with the UK operator. I mean, because National Grid is the ESO over in the UK, we've had the opportunity of really sitting down with the ESO and learning how they're thinking about energy storage, how they see energy storage integrating into their markets. We do run very different electricity markets though in New England, New York, UK. So it's been good to have those learnings to see how other people are thinking about and share perspectives. But because the markets are so different, I can't say we've been able to really adopt many of the same principles though.
Okay. And just a quick technical question for me. You mentioned fault protection as an issue. I guess this is to do with the lack of fault current from inverters. And if so, is that an opportunity for research? Should we be looking at new ways to detect faults?
I think it is a great opportunity for research. That was one of the areas where I talked about bringing in Pacific National Labs. One of the reasons why we brought them in wasn't just the market elements, but was also using their models that they have for energy storage in order to figure out the faults in the ground issues that we have on the island. We actually did install grounding transformers in order to help with some of those issues, which actually increased the cost quite a bit. There's still some debate as to whether we have to do that or not, but we take reliability very seriously, and so that's why we went forward with it. But if more was understood about how inverters really how the inverters will impact the system, that would have helped us tremendously.
Okay, thanks. And we've got a couple of other questions. One from Philip Sharman here is about this idea of looking. You've got quite a long duration storage system there. Anyway, compared to a lot that have been installed, and Philip's asking, what other ES technologies, what storage technologies might you consider for even longer durations?
Yeah, so I mentioned when I went over the overview of the different types of energy storage projects we have, all of them are lithium ion except for one, the vanadium flow battery that we have in central Massachusetts. That's really an R&D project. We don't use it for grid security. That project is R&D project in cooperation with the Department of Energy. And one of the things that we're finding is that from a technology standpoint, what the industry supports and what's really out there in terms of comfortness, that lithium ion is really the thing that is where people are really comfortable with it. Whereas even though we have the flow battery on our network, is not something that is really met the stage where we're ready to put them through our network and use them from a reliability standpoint. But I will also mention that when we went for procurement, we had an open procurement and we got roughly about 30 different bids. Of those 30, only 2 were vanadium flow batteries, and the cost was far greater than any of the lithium ion proposals we received. Another issue was just the space requirements itself. I don't know if you can kind of tell from this picture, but that energy storage takes up roughly about 1/4 of an acre of land. Mm-hmm. The flow battery proposals were about 1/2 acre of land.
Okay. Yeah, that's quite significant. Okay, I think there's time for just one other question, and one from Dan right there about whether you've considered using second life lithium-ion batteries from EVs.
Yeah, so that was really in the hands of the different bid proposals that we received. None of the bid proposals actually went into using second life. In fact, we had a number of questions to them about recycling the existing storage and how they would look at that, how we would augment and replace over time. And I think that's partly something that the industry, especially energy storage integrators, are still struggling with because they actually didn't have really good answers for that. And that's actually a still open question for us. We have a 20-year contract with Tesla in order to augment this, in order to keep that constant 48 megawatt hours throughout the life of the project. Mm-hmm. And it's really up for them to figure out if they want to use recycled batteries. Our commitment with them is that they have to maintain that 48 megawatt hours for us.
Okay, well, thanks very much. It was a really interesting talk and good to see how things are developing somewhere a bit different. We do hear a lot about the UK market here. I don't know if you can see the chat. There might be a couple of other questions pop up, but there is one from Dermot there that you can, if you can find the time, just have a look at that and maybe answer those online.
Okay.
Thanks again from everyone here. I think I'll move on to Flora, if you're ready, Flora.
Hi, yes, I'm ready. Can you see and hear me?
I can see you and hear you. Yeah, so Flora's going to present about exploring the suitability of different battery technologies. And it's actually for frequency response rather than energy arbitrage. Okay, thanks, Flora.
Okay, hopefully you should be able to see it now. Can you see it okay?
Yeah, that's great. We can see everything now, Flora.
Cool. That's good. Right, I'm just going to put on a timer so that I don't overrun. Okay, hi everybody. First of all, thank you very much for taking the time to watch my presentation today. I appreciate it. A lot of you already know me from the CDT, but for those of you who don't, my name's Flora. I'm a second year PhD student at the University of Sheffield in cohort 5 of the CDT, and I'm being sponsored by Drax. So today I'm going to present some work that I've done on the topic of exploring the suitability of different battery technologies for frequency response. So here's a little overview of my talk today. I'm going to start by introducing my topic, describing my motivation and aims and a little bit of background. Then I'm going to present my methodology and results and discussion. And if I've got time at the end, I've got a few additional slides that I'd like to share with you. So first things first, what is the motivation behind my talk? Well, if we can assess the value of energy storage, we can use it to make future predictions about its deployment, which might be of interest to both industry and policymakers, and also CDT students debating the topic. Hence, with this in mind, my main aim is to quantify the value of different types of energy storage providing frequency response in Great Britain. So, as Roger Hollies said earlier, batteries are excellent at frequency response. Now, in this work, I want to almost flip this and answer the question, is frequency response great for batteries? Is this a way that we should be using them? So in order to do this, we need to understand what is frequency response, how does it work? We need to assess the real-time usage of energy storage providing frequency response and whether or not this is viable. And finally, we also want to assess the degradation of batteries providing this service and its consequent effects on the lifetime and value of the batteries. So what is frequency response? Well, frequency response is a grid service which counters deviations in frequency away from 50 Hertz, which is the nominal frequency which Great Britain's national grid must try to maintain. I'm going to be considering specifically firm frequency response, FFR here, and this is one of several different types of frequency response services. And the reason for considering this is it creates a route to market for smaller providers, such as energy storage, which might be unable to participate in other markets. So we can model the usage of energy storage providing frequency response using grid frequency data. So here I've plotted the storage output against grid frequency. And we can see that the storage output can be both positive and negative, depending on whether the storage is discharging or charging. We can see that for frequencies close to 50 Hertz, we have this region known as the dead band, where the storage output is just 0. As we move away from this region, the storage output is going to be proportional to the frequency deviation. So we can use this with historic frequency data in order to analyze what the output of the storage providing this service is going to be. So here I've done this using data from January 2018. So I've plotted the change in capacity of a 1 megawatt FFR provider. So you can see that there's times when the capacity is going to decrease and times when it's going to increase. Now, in order to assess the viability of energy storage providing FFR, we need to consider the amount of usable capacity that our energy storage has. So for example, if we only have 1 megawatt hour of usable capacity, then actually we can no longer provide FFR after 100 hours or so, because we run out of usable capacity with which to do this. So we're going to propose some balancing strategies in order to keep the state of charge of the batteries between their usable limits, which here we're going to define as 20% state of charge, and 100% state of charge. So we're going to propose 3 different balancing strategies to do this. And they're going to involve purchasing and selling power in National Grid's balancing market. And the power which we're using to do this is going to be separate from the power used for FFR, such that we don't exceed the maximum available power of the storage. So the first of these balancing strategies, strategy 1, aims to minimize the transactions in the balancing market. So when the state of charge of the battery falls below 0.3, we're going to purchase a volume of electricity which brings the state of charge back to its usable midpoint of 0.6. And likewise, when the state of charge rises above 0.9, we're going to sell a volume of electricity to bring its state of charge back to 0.6. Strategy 2 is a little bit more involved. So the main aim of this is to maintain the state of charge at all points as close as possible to 0.6. So at all of these different levels of state of charge, we're going to purchase or sell different volumes of electricity in the balancing market to bring the battery's state of charge back to 0.6. Finally, strategy 3 involves minimizing losses in the balancing market. So at each of these different state of charge levels, we're going to do one of 2 different actions, depending on what the balancing market prices are like, whether they're advantageous or disadvantageous. So for example, an advantageous price would be selling at a high price or purchasing at a low price. Okay, so now we're going to apply this to some batteries. I'm going to consider lithium ion and lead acid. I'm not going to consider any specific chemistries here because most of the literature which this is based upon is quite general. It doesn't specify any particular battery chemistries. So we can parameterize our batteries by their maximum power output and their maximum capacity. And we've also got these different costs associated with different parts of our energy storage projects. And so here I'm showing costs for 2018 and predicted for 2025. We can also talk about the lifetime associated with these different types of batteries, which is typically 10 or 3 years for lithium ion and lead acid batteries respectively, or we can define it as the amount of time it takes for the batteries to degrade to 80% of the initial capacity. So bearing this in mind, we can do a couple of calculations to assess the value of our batteries. We can calculate their initial costs, the yearly maintenance costs, and the net present value of the batteries, where we're summing up over the first lifetime, so not considering any second life purposes, the cash flow, which is going to be the income due to providing FFR and minus the balancing market costs and also yearly maintenance costs. And we're going to consider a discount rate of 0.1 here. And in particular, in the final year of the cash flow analysis, we're also going to consider the residual value of the batteries. So in other words, how much can we sell them on for second life purposes? So in order to assess this, we're going to use a declining balance method of depreciation. And I've chosen to use an acceleration rate of 2, which essentially means that I assume the value of the battery is going to degrade quite quickly. And L here is defined as total useful lifetime, which we're considering as first life plus second life. And I've extracted some average values for second life lifetime for the batteries from the literature here. Okay, and finally, we also want to consider the degradation of the batteries in order to assess their lifetime, which we said previously was the amount of time that it takes for them to degrade to 80% of the initial capacity. So I'm using this formula here, which is from the literature and involves summing over half and whole cycles in the charge-discharge cycling of the batteries and their cycle depth. And in order to assess the number of half and whole cycles and cycle depth, I'm going to use a rain flow counting algorithm, which essentially involves comparing consecutive peaks and troughs in a time series. And this is applicable to both lithium ion and lead acid batteries simply by changing the parameters X and Y. Okay, so before I jump into the results, I'm just going to summarize my methodology. As I'm aware, it's just after lunch. We're probably all a little bit sleepy. So we're going to use grid frequency data in order to assess the storage output of some batteries providing FFR. We're going to balance the batteries in real time using these three strategies, which I outlined earlier. The resulting capacity profile, we're going to feed into a rain flow counting algorithm, and we're going to use this to assess the degradation of the batteries and therefore calculate their lifetime. And then we're going to apply all of this to some economics calculations to figure out the value of our batteries. So firstly, here, I'm showing the results of the capacity change of the batteries over 1 year using 2018 data with the three different strategies and with no balancing at all. So we can see that in the no balancing case, quite quickly we fall outside of the usable capacity limits of our battery, which are denoted by these dashed lines here. So it's not viable to perform this without any balancing. We can see that all three of the strategies succeed in keeping the battery's capacity within its usable limits. And in particular, strategy 2 keeps the capacity very close to 0.6, which is what we wanted. Additionally, we can see here the losses in the balancing market, and that strategy 3 does indeed minimize these losses compared with the other two. Okay, so now let's have a look at how the batteries perform over their lifetime in terms of their net present value. So here I'm showing the net present value of lithium ion batteries using 2025 prices for the three different strategies. And I'm showing this for different sized batteries. On the y-axis, we have the maximum capacity of our batteries. And on the x-axis, we have the maximum power. The blue squares denote a negative net present value. And the pink squares denote a positive net present value. So as we can see, there's not many scenarios where we're seeing positive net present value whatsoever. The ones that we are when we've balanced the batteries using strategy 2. Now, the reason for this is with strategy 2, the cycle depth was much less because we were keeping the capacity close to 0.6 at all times. And as a result of this, it was observed that these batteries balanced with strategy 2 degrade much more slowly than with the other two strategies. Therefore, they have a longer lifetime, and we can keep on generating value with them for longer periods of time. Hence why they have a positive net present value with strategy 2.
5 minutes, please.
Oh, okay. We can also see that in order to get the best value, we want to have low capacity. Now, the reason for this is related to the upfront costs involved in installing high capacity batteries. And we want to have high power, however. And this is because we've got more power available for providing FFR, and therefore we can generate more revenue through this. So let's move on now to lead acid batteries. Unfortunately, it's not looking quite so good. We don't actually have any positive net present value scenarios under the market conditions considered here. So it's not looking quite so good as with the lithium-ion batteries. Okay, so just to reiterate what I've said, strategy 2 adds the most value, and this is because it reduces the degradation and therefore increases lifetime. We've seen that with lower capacity, we can get higher value. And for the lithium-ion batteries, higher power batteries are preferable. So power-dense lithium-ion batteries seem to be the most suitable for this purpose. Okay. How long have I got left? I've got a few additional slides, but I don't know whether to go into them or not.
We've got about 2 or 3 minutes, so maybe if we could
Okay.
hold it there, and then there might be some questions. So.
Yes. Okay. So I'll just end here then, and address any questions that you might have. So just to conclude, low energy, high power lithium-ion batteries appear to be the most suitable. Under current market conditions and assumptions made here, lead-acid batteries are not suitable for this purpose. And we've seen that if we want to use batteries for FFR, the best way to prolong their lifetime, increase their value, is to balance them heavily in order to keep their state of charge balanced in the middle and reduce decycling. So I'll leave it there and thank all of you for your attention, and thank in particular my co-authors and supervisor, and also to the reviewers for their helpful feedback. And yeah, please let me know if you've got any questions.
Okay, thanks very much, Flora. Again, if you can put questions on the chat for Flora. One from me. As you know, I keep quite a good eye on what's going on in the kind of EV market with batteries and so on. And the latest kind of Bloomberg pricing is that actual pack prices, so not the battery itself, but complete packs for EVs, are at about under 150, well, $156 a kilowatt hour in 2019. And there's reports that there's lithium-ion batteries going into buses in China at under $100 a kilowatt hour. I just wondered if you'd done any sensitivity analysis to capital cost and what impact that might have.
I haven't yet.
Well below your figures.
I haven't yet, but yeah, those prices sound really good. So yeah, send me links to that, because I definitely would be interested in seeing how those different prices affect the value. The prices that I was showing previously were from a report that was published in 2018, so they're clearly not quite up to date. But yeah, please do send those over. I'd be interested to see what the results look like with those different prices.
Okay, thank you. Does anyone else have any questions? Probably time for one. Oh, there's just one here from Nick, just to answer. Have you tried a hybrid lithium-ion lead acid analysis?
No, I haven't tried that, but it's certainly something to try. Yeah, I'd be interested to see how that would work. Thanks for the idea. Yeah, something to consider in the future.
Yeah. Okay, and then thanks again to Flora. If I can get, if you can stop sharing and then get Sam to set up. While Sam's setting up, Dermot asked a question about, are stationary storage modules more expensive than EV ones? I think the answer to that is possibly, quite possibly they are. The only reason I think the prices might be a bit lower than Flora used is because the prices from Bloomberg are actually pack prices, actually built up into a pack. So it would be interesting to see if we can find other sources for that. But we'll move on. Sam is all set up, so going to hear about investigating the benefits of the newly proposed frequency response services in GB. So thanks, Sam.
Cool. So you can see my slides.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah.
And clearly you can hear me and see me as well, so that's good. Okay, hi everyone. My name is Sam. I'm a PhD student supervised by Solomon Brown. I'm sponsored by RWE, and I'm also part of the Energy Storage CET and based at the University of Sheffield. So today I'm going to talk to you about my investigations into the benefits of the newly proposed frequency response services in Great Britain. Okay, so firstly I want to explain some definitions I will use throughout this presentation. Grid frequency and the power imbalance of the grid have a close relationship. If generation is greater than demand, then the frequency rises. And if demand is greater than generation, then the frequency falls. National Grid aim to keep the frequency as close to 50 Hertz as possible on a second-by-second basis. Occasionally, the frequency will deviate higher than 50.2 Hertz, which I will define as a high frequency event, and occasionally it will deviate lower than 49.8 Hertz, which I define as a low frequency event. And on the graph on the right is just an example of a low frequency event. So, I got lots of frequency data from 2014 to 2019 from National Grid, and here you can see a plot of the number of frequency events per month and also the standard deviation of each month. And just a couple of things to note. So there's obviously this quite large increase in number of events from 2015 to 2018. And it's also reflected in the increase in the standard deviation. And I've been trying to look into what might be underlying causes behind this, which I'm not going to talk about today. But I think it's almost too complex to pull apart what exactly is the cause here. But it's interesting nonetheless. Another thing to know is just that high events, there are twice as many as low events in this time period. Okay, so as I said, the system operator tries to manage the frequency, and they do this by using frequency response services. So this is generational demand units that can vary their power input or output automatically based on a frequency deviation to try and bring it back down to, bring it back to 50 Hertz. So I'll just quickly list the traditional frequency response services. So there's, if the frequency goes below 50 Hertz, you have primary and secondary frequency response. Primary is the first responder, needs to respond within 10 seconds. And then after that, secondary takes over and is longer duration. Then when the frequency is above 50, you've got high frequency response, which basically does the job of primary and secondary in that it has to respond quickly but last indefinitely on the high side. There's this newer product, which I've still classed as a traditional frequency response service because it's been around since sort of 2017. It's enhanced frequency response, which is there's about 200 megawatts in Great Britain, provided by batteries, and it has to respond within 1 second, and it's symmetric, so it responds when the frequency's low and high. It does both. On the right, I've created this graph from going through data from Elexon and National Grid, and it's showing the contributions to primary frequency response holding volume each year from different technologies. So you can see that CCGTs and pumped storage provide the greatest contribution. Coal has obviously declined in recent years, and then we have since 2016 this uptick in response from demand side flexibility, batteries, and hybrid systems. And I'm sure if I had data for 2019 and 2020, we'd see that yellow line increase even further. So that moves me on to newly proposed frequency response services, which is what this presentation is all about. So there are 4 newly proposed services. There's dynamic regulation. And if I take you to the bottom left graph, this is just showing the response profile of all the different services. So it's just how much power they need to output depending on the frequency deviation, because the 3 I show in this graph are all dynamic. So their response is proportional to whatever the deviation is. And with dynamic regulation, it has to respond as soon as the frequency goes outside of the small deadband, and then be at maximum response by 0.1 plus or minus 0.1 Hertz. And on the right, you can see this is about the response speed. So dynamic regulation doesn't have to be that fast. Delay time of 2 seconds and full response by 10 seconds, a bit like primary in the traditional services. And then, so dynamic moderation and containment, they are much faster responding. So they need to respond within 0.5 seconds and be at full required output by 1 second. And their profiles, moderation is between 0.1 and 0.2, and containment is whenever the frequency goes outside of 0.2 hertz. And then there's also something called static containment, which is not proportional to frequency. It's just sort of, it switches on when the frequency gets to a certain point. But I won't discuss that really further in this presentation. So in summary, you have regulation, which is regulating the frequency all the time. Moderation occasionally assists with this, and then dynamic containment is for when there's infrequent events, say a generator trips, and the frequency needs to be arrested quickly and then brought back up to 50 hertz. So these are my research questions. I was looking at what is the efficacy of the proposed new FR services compared with the traditional frequency response services, and then also how do the proposed new services deal with a future reduced inertia scenario. So this is a bit about my methodology. So on the top, you see the swing equation, which I've put into a grid model in MATLAB Simulink. So what it's really showing is there's a fundamental link between rate of change of frequency on the left-hand side and then power imbalance on the right-hand side. And this power imbalance of the grid is made up of your fundamental imbalance. So that could just be a generator tripping, giving you minus 1,000 megawatts straight away on the grid. And then your demand damping is a self-stabilizing property of the grid. And then you've got frequency response, which aims to counteract those imbalances that occur. And then also you can see that the inertia of the grid is inversely proportional to the rate of change of frequency. So step one of my method is first run the grid model to get the underlying imbalance that occurred over a period of time. So my inputs are demand, inertia, frequency response. So that's the volumes that were online and also the characteristics of how fast were they responding, and then also frequency. And then I use that to get an imbalance. And then step two is then to run a rearranged grid model to get the frequency. So my inputs here are demand, inertia, frequency response, and then the imbalance I've previously created. Now, of course, if I kept everything the same, you would just get the same frequency profile. So but what I use this for is then to tweak the inertia profile and also the frequency response characteristics, and then see what effect that has on the frequency profile. So I decided to choose a case study month, November 2018. And I chose this for the reason that it had the highest standard deviation out of any of the months between 2014 and 2019. And it also had the second highest number of total frequency events. So it was a month of high frequency volatility. And so if I'm using that and then also looking at a future scenario based on it, I wanted to sort of consider a worst case scenario. And that's sort of the worst case month that I've got data for. So I run through my methods. So I use Alexon and National Grid data I use National Grid and Alexon generation data to get demand and inertia for November 2018. With inertia, I also had to use estimated inertia constants for different generation types. So I have my demand profile, inertia profile. My frequency response volumes are from looking at a National Grid market report where they talk about what volumes they procured for November 2018 and how much capacity at different times of the day. So that's a profile that runs throughout the month. And then also I've got a second by second frequency data for November 2018. I run that through and I get then an imbalance for November 2018, which you can see here on the right. This is the distribution of that imbalance. And then I basically use that imbalance then going forward for the rest of my simulations. And then this is just the method behind the reduced inertia scenario, which I've called November 2030. So I've used National Grid future energy scenarios, 2019, and they had, in that year, they had a scenario called community renewables, where I chose this because this is where wind and solar have the highest increase in capacity. So I look at their increase in capacity and I basically multiply their generation in November 2018 by this capacity ratio and make the assumption that in November 2030, if all the conditions were the same, this is how much wind and solar generation there would be. I do the same for nuclear as well. And then what I do is I just say, well, okay, I assumed that the demand profile was the same from 2018 to 2030, which when at the time, from the future energy scenarios, this seemed reasonable because they didn't predict the demand would change that much in a decade. It was more post 2030 it would really change. So any generation then that's left over between this wind, solar, and nuclear and the demand, I don't care what it is. I've just given it an inertia constant, and I've come up with different sort of inertia scenarios, which you can see in this table and also in the graph. And just to give the example that I'm going to take forward, basically the worst case scenario is that inertia is only provided by nuclear and demand. And in fact, demand inertia, I've said, is 75% of what it is now, assuming that there are fewer synchronously connected demand units in 2030. And then the example generation mix for whatever's left over if wind, solar, and nuclear don't meet the demand is, for example, interconnectors and batteries, which don't offer traditional inertia to the grid. On the left is the inertia profiles, sort of as a duration curve, as it were, and so the median inertia in November 2018 was 298 GVAs, and in the scenario I'm taking forward, the median inertia is 66 GVAs, so 20% of what it was in November 2018. So here are some results then. So this is looking at the new frequency response services, but just performing on a November 2018 scenario. So I found that the sum of dynamic moderation and dynamic regulation together, their capacity really affects the number of events that occur during the month. And if their sum is 300 megawatts, then you get similar number of events to what really happened in November 2018. And then I found that the only thing really that affected standard deviation was the dynamic regulation capacity. So dynamic regulation, just to remind you, is the one that that's been performed continuously and has very tight regions of when it's used. And somewhere between 100 and 150 megawatts of this is enough to bring the standard deviation to what was seen in November 2018. Yeah, so this is just comparing the traditional frequency response services in 2018 and the new frequency response services. And there's quite a lot here, and I don't have that much time, so I'm just going to pick out. So one thing, so dynamic moderation, here I've got its idle time, so it's 90% of the time it's not being used, so the frequency is within plus or minus 0.1 hertz.
5 minutes.
Yep, thank you, Rachel. And then it's with its delivery volume, you can see that it's not that symmetric, so it's having to output power a lot more than it has to take in. So this just raises questions on how you would manage a battery in this situation, because it's going to run out of state of charge if you do nothing, but it is idle 90% of the time, so there's plenty of time to manage the state of charge. But that's not something I've looked at here, but just something I wanted to point out. And then this is my last results slide. So this is then looking at November 2030. So at the top here, we have the number of frequency events that would occur if you just kept the traditional frequency response services online. So you have an increase from 239 events to 3,259, a small increase in the standard deviation. Now, with the new frequency response services at the capacities that I've shown here on this previous slide, there is a much smaller increase in the number of events, 208 to 735. So they perform a lot better under reduced inertia conditions than the traditional frequency response services, because there are faster acting products within the suite. So just to conclude, I've got my research questions at the top again, and so I'd say that the new FR services have a much more distinct role than the traditional services. Dynamic regulation maintains an acceptable standard deviation. Moderation works with regulation to prevent too many frequency excursions outside of 0.2 Hertz. And dynamic containment, which is actually online at the moment, started in October, is for protecting the grid against rare but large frequency events. And all three of them together, if you put all their capacities together, that's really what's going to determine how you can manage your frequency when there's a large in-feed loss. And then also the proposed new frequency response services cope with the reduced inertia scenario better than the current FR services due to a higher capacity of faster response. And yeah, that's it. So thank you for listening.
Okay, thank you, Sam. It was interesting stuff to kind of catch up with what you're doing. Again, if anyone's got any quick questions, we've probably got time just for one or two. I've just got one. There's been a lot in the news recently about the high cost of ancillary services. Well, maybe not in the mainstream news, but the kind of news I read. And I wondered if you'd looked at the relative costs of the two control methods. Is this new control method going to be cheaper?
Well, I think that's just a really good question, and my answer is I haven't yet. That's sort of my next step, really, is to look at the cost, because yeah, in this presentation, it's sort of more just the physics of it. You know, does it reduce frequency events?
Mm-hmm.
And I want to take this further and then have a look at how do these new services affect battery degradation. So I guess once I've done that, I can then try and put it all together and do a cost comparison of your traditional response, which could be a bunch of CCGTs providing primary, compared to batteries providing a lot of these new services. Yeah, so my answer is I haven't done that yet, but it's something for the future.
Okay, thanks for that. If nobody else has got any questions, then we'll take our coffee break now, and we'll be back in 10 minutes with Andre. Thanks again, Sam, and for all our speakers in that session.